They say the land around Black Hollow Creek stopped growing wildflowers after 1914. Locals whispered it was the frost. But frost doesn't leave burned footprints near riverbeds. Frost doesn't make the air smell like old bleach and rust in midsummer. Between 1914 and 1932, 31 individuals either vanished or were declared mentally unfit to return home after brief stays at the Thornwell estate, a massive, ivy-stained manor hidden among the hills of Grayston County. Most were young, mostly female, and almost all were either related to or employed by the Thornwell family. No official inquiry was ever launched. A few grieving relatives tried, but each time they were met with dusty records stamped "closed at the family's request" or "insufficient evidence." Town officials claimed misidentifications. Doctors cited neural fatigue, domestic hysteria, and voluntary withdrawal from public life. None of them mentioned the manuscripts found burned near the estate's furnace, pages of frantic ink describing mirror lessons, obedience programming, and something called the hollowing process. At first glance, the Thornwells were simply one of those old money families, part landowners, part patrons of reform, education, and the local church. Their home, a four-winged Victorian fortress, served as a girls' boarding school in the 1880s, then later as a psycho-spiritual renewal center run by clergy and hired doctors. Officially, it was a place of recovery and moral realignment. But those who returned came back wrong. In 1926, Eleanor Thornwell, aged 16, was the first family member entered into reform. The reason? Frequent emotional instability, a diagnosis now interpreted as ordinary teenage depression. When she returned 3 months later, she couldn't recognize her mother, didn't speak for 2 weeks, and stared at walls like she was reading invisible text. Her journal pages were found blank, every line removed, the ink stripped clean. She wasn't alone. Over the next 6 years, others followed. A 9-year-old boy from the village, the maid Clara, the young teacher Rosalind Fay, and Margaret Thornwell, Eleanor's mother, who allegedly volunteered for a weekend of reflection after raising concerns about her daughter's condition. Margaret never came back. She was later declared dead from a self-inflicted hanging in a locked bedroom, though no one outside the family saw the body. In 1933, a fire broke out in the west wing of the estate. It should have consumed the entire house, but it only damaged the library and basement medical room. When firemen arrived, they found no one inside, not a single living soul, no signs of struggle, no blood. Just a thin red line drawn across every mirror, and the smell of ammonia that made men gag. One fireman was hospitalized afterward for seizures, repeating the phrase, "Obey and remain, obey and remain, obey and remain." That was the last year anyone was officially admitted to the Thornwell Institute. Then, silence. The building was sealed. Property passed through shell companies. Rumors faded. The family name was scrubbed from town records. Some said they moved to Europe. Others said they stayed underground, literally. But one girl survived. Her name was Isabel Thornwell, 18 years old. Records say she escaped during a storm in 1934, carrying 2 blood-stained pages, a small red ribbon, and a hand-drawn map of the basement's lower levels. She told townspeople what she'd seen: treatment rooms lined with lead, children strapped to soundproof chairs, an entire chamber called the echo cell, where thoughts were repeated back until the subject broke. The sheriff took her statement, and then he burned the papers. She was escorted to an aunt's estate across state lines and was never seen again under her real name. To this day, no official body count has been confirmed, but strange coincidences surround those connected to the Thornwell name. Every decade or so, a descendant vanishes, Some wake screaming with no memory of who they are. Others report being followed by men in brown coats, always holding small black books. Historians trying to uncover the truth found their requests for records delayed indefinitely. Audio recordings sent to university archives were wiped blank, as if erased with a tone beyond human frequency. One researcher even tried to map out the Thornwell family tree. He gave up after page 3, where the same 5 names kept repeating in new combinations, with birth and death dates shifting mysteriously. But this story isn't about the tree. It's about the root rot that spread underneath. It's about the corrections that were never just educational. It's about the shadows that still live in the foundation of that manor, which was eventually bulldozed but never rebuilt. No one touches the land. Animals won't go near it. There's a new fence there now. No signs, just barbed wire and a motion sensor that's always blinking red. And even after all these years, the silence around the Thornwell estate still feels practiced, like something or someone is making sure it stays that way. What really happened was much worse than anyone imagined. He arrived with no luggage, just a coat too dark for spring and a leather case that clicked open like a surgical tray. Dr. Emery Halbridge, the man who would soon be referred to, quietly and only in private, as the voice fixer. There were no public announcements about his role. The Thornwells simply introduced him during an Easter gathering in 1924. A family advisor, they said, a man of medicine and moral balance. He stood among them with a practiced smile, a dull calm in his eyes, and fingers that twitched slightly when he wasn't writing. He was tall and thin, wore black even on Sundays, and always smelled faintly of iron and lavender oil. Children were told not to speak to him unless spoken to. Adults said he had the look of someone who had never truly been a child himself. His mission, as he explained in a single recorded statement preserved in private archives, was this: to restore alignment between voice, thought, and duty. There is too much noise in disobedience. If a soul can be tuned like an instrument, it may yet learn harmony. Behind those words was the true goal: compliance, total programmable obedience, and the Thornwells gave him everything he needed: money, subjects, silence. The manor's east wing was repurposed upon his arrival. Thick doors were reinforced with iron cores. Soundproofing foam was installed behind every wall. Visitors who walked those halls described a pressure in the ears, as if sound had been forcibly removed. Some said it felt like drowning in silence. Rooms were assigned new labels: observation chamber, correction bay, echo cell, and each came with its own set of protocols. Loudspeakers installed in the ceilings played repeating phrases at low frequencies, often overnight. You are still. You are hollow. Hollow is good. Halbridge didn't work alone. 2 others arrived weeks later. Sister Eugenia, a woman in her 50s with glassy eyes and ink-stained fingernails, carried boxes of red folders and never spoke above a whisper. Brother Mathis, her assistant, was a mute, either by vow or procedure. He communicated through hand signals and clicks made with a metal tongue plate that echoed faintly in hallways. Together they created what they called the obedience ladder, a series of stages the subject would ascend or descend depending on behavioral purity. It began with eye contact discipline, then voice tone correction, then memory purification. Phase 5 was simply labeled Return to Root. No outsider ever learned what that meant. Locals were wary, but paid to stay silent. The Thornwells donated vast amounts to churches, orphanages, and even the Grayston Sheriff's Office. Most in town dismissed the rumors. Rich people do weird things in big houses, one bartender later joked in a 1962 interview. But if they pay your cousin's hospital bills, you stop asking. Still, some things couldn't be hidden. Postmen began noticing letters with identical handwriting, even from different family members. Gardeners refused to work near the east wing after hearing metal screams that seemed to vibrate in the soil. And once, a plumber was called to fix a leak under the chapel and found a nest of microphones, all pointing upward toward the confession booth. He was paid in cash and never asked to return. The Thornwells' outward behavior changed, too. They became calmer, more organized, but eerily synchronized. Dinners were eaten in total silence except for the exact same prayer repeated each night, led by different voices but spoken in the same slow cadence. Visitors reported that the younger children had stopped blinking in natural rhythm. One guest swore Eleanor Thornwell blinked only every 40 seconds on cue, like a reset. And then there was the basement staircase. Built directly beneath the dining hall, it was added shortly after Halbridge's arrival, covered with a thick velvet curtain and always locked. Only Eugenia and Brother Mathis had the key. Once, a guest tried to wander down during a New Year's party and was pulled back violently by a maid who whispered, "Downstairs is for the unlearning." A year later, Rosalind Fay, the newly hired governess, confided in a local librarian that she feared the children were being used in psychological trials. She said she'd seen inkless books filled with nothing but punctured pages and lined scratches. The children called them thinking books. When she asked what they meant, one girl replied, "They read us back when we're wrong." Rosalind vanished that summer. Her personal trunk was mailed back to her sister, with no clothes, just her hairbrush and a note with a single line. Harmony is the highest obedience. Dr. Halber. Idge's power over the family grew. By 1928, family decisions were made only with his approval. Visitors were vetted through the echo chamber. Newborns were observed before they were named. And birthday gifts were screened for non-aligning imagery. There were no more laughter echoes in the Thornwell halls, no more arguments, just murmured prayers and the quiet hiss of ventilation behind the walls, as if the house itself were exhaling something carefully filtered. The townsfolk began calling the place the manor that breathed in reverse, but no one said that to the family's face, not if they wanted to stay whole. It wasn't just what they did inside the Thornwell manor, it was what they built the manor to do. From the outside it looked traditional, Victorian arches, crawling ivy, and sharp-angled rooftops. But the renovations made after Dr. Halbridge's arrival were neither aesthetic nor practical. They were surgical. Sound traps, sensory denial, environmental isolation. Each wing of the estate was redesigned not to comfort, but to erase. The walls were lined with dense rubber layers, sandwiched between plaster and stone to absorb cries. Ceiling vents did not circulate air. They broadcast white noise at frequencies that interfered with cognitive clarity. Visitors often reported headaches and short-term memory loss after standing near the East Corridor stairwell for more than 10 minutes. Windows were narrow and tinted, designed not to let light in but to restrict time perception. Subjects, referred to in records as guests of reformation, often couldn't tell morning from night. Diaries recovered by a groundskeeper decades later included entries such as, "Third morning, still dark. They say I am not ready to see the sun. Lights flash, I speak. Lights off, I sleep, or not." Each room was numbered in prime digits only, a belief of Halbridge that non-mirroring namasa bears confused the subconscious into surrender. Room 7 was known as the tuning chamber. Room 11 was Obedience Bay. Room 13 had no official name, only a warning sign: voices remain behind. Only non-compliant individuals were admitted, but the definition of non-compliance changed weekly. Some were orphans with vivid imaginations, Others were young girls who read too much, refused arranged marriages, or asked why prayers had to be whispered instead of spoken aloud. Eleanor Thornwell was one of the earliest. She liked to write poems under the willow tree. Hallbridge read her verses once and declared them fragments of ego disturbance. She was entered into stage 2 conditioning. After 7 weeks, her writing stopped altogether. When given a pencil, she simply drew concentric circles and asked, "Which one is the real me?" Then came Clara Meyer, a 27-year-old housemaid. She was known for her honesty, her gentle tone, and her habit of humming when she worked. But Clara once entered the dining room early and overheard a lesson in voice training, a girl being told to repeat, "I am obedient," while submerged up to her neck in cold water. Clara told a gardener. 2 days later, she was reassigned to Chamber 5, light adjustment therapy. When she returned, her eyes could no longer tolerate daylight. She walked with hands in front of her, as if blindfolded by memory. She was dismissed from service, labeled mentally unstable. 5 years later, she died in an asylum, screaming at walls that kept breathing her thoughts back to her. The building itself became a tool of the hollowing process. Mirrors were inverted, facing walls or hidden behind curtains. Subjects were only allowed to view themselves through etched glass, which distorted their reflections. Hallbridge believed true obedience began when self-image was no longer fixed. One instruction repeated to female patients, "You are not what you see, you are what you repeat." Even bathrooms were modified. There were no locks, no labels on soap bottles. Showers had no hot water knobs, only cold. The chill way is described as corrective immersion, designed to reduce emotional response. The basement was the epicenter. A long hallway known as the Whisper Spine stretched beneath the manor. Walls there were padded with lead, and floor tiles had no reflections. No photos exist of the rooms. Only a burned blueprint, recovered in 1976, shows its shape, a series of interconnected circles mimicking a neural map. This is where the reprogramming reels were used, audio devices designed by Brother Mathis to play looped affirmations directly into the ears of subjects during sleep. The reels whispered messages at 0.5x speed, altering the cadence of inner thought. One surviving reel says, "You are hollow. Hollow is harmony. Harmony is peace. Be peace. Be hollow." But the most disturbing element wasn't the architecture, it was the language. Over time, the way people in the house spoke began to shift. Words were swapped subtly. Punishment became adjustment. Suffering became cleansing. Isolation was called inner work. And when someone died, they simply said, "She has become silent." Servants were forbidden from referring to anyone by name once hollowing began. Instead, titles were used. The quiet one, the returning, the cleansed, the resistance, always said with fear. One janitor's final log described an encounter near Chamber 9. He saw a girl, no older than 10, standing completely still, eyes closed, whispering to the wall. He tried to speak to her. She didn't move. But when he turned to leave, she said, "The house is remembering me wrong. Please fix it." Victims weren't just corrected. They were rewritten, recoded to behave, to obey, to forget. By the time they were sent home, or buried or erased, there was no sign of who they were, only echoes, and even those faded quickly. The walls didn't echo. They swallowed. I wasn't supposed to be near the east basement. I was just a groundskeeper. Thomas Vale, 31, worked the hedges and gravel, never asked questions, never wanted trouble. But one evening in October 1929, the wind knocked open the side cellar door. I went to latch it, and what I saw still follows me when I sleep. The corridor was humid, like someone had boiled water and sealed it in. Lights buzzed above me in a flickering line. The walls were padded, but not with cushioning. No, these were walls designed to absorb panic. The floor wasn't tiled. It was stitched, thin leather, cross-seamed. Footsteps didn't echo. They vanished. I followed the sound of soft voices. No cries, no shouting, just counting. 1, 2, 3. You are clean. Again. 1, 2. Behind a steel door labeled Echo 11, I peeked through a glass slot. Inside, a girl about 12 sat in a metal chair bolted to the floor. Her arms were tied with silk bands. Her mouth wasn't gagged, but she wasn't speaking. A machine to her left, a sort of box with reel-to-reel film and blinking lights, whirred steadily. Wires ran from the machine to her ears, taped in place. And across from her stood Dr. Hulbridge, holding a rod with a glass bulb on the end. He dipped it into a jar of clear liquid. Chloroform? Ether? I don't know. And then held it under the girl's nose for 3 seconds. She twitched once. Her eyes flickered. Her lips parted like she wanted to scream, but couldn't. He spoke gently, like a parent teaching a child to read. Repeat the truth now. Speak it before silence returns. Her voice was thin, crackling like a burnt wire. I am nothing until I'm corrected. I am clay. You are the hand. Then silence again. The machine beeped once. The girl's head tilted to the right. Not like sleep. Like she shut down. I backed away. But the next room was worse. It was lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars, hundreds of them. Each had a label, names and dates written in red. Floating inside, strips of flesh, strands of hair, even what looked like bits of tongue. I saw one jar labeled Rosalind F. A. 1930. Inside was an eyeball, and in the corner, a wall of photographs, portraits of girls, some smiling, some not, all with a red line scratched across the eyes. Then I heard something behind me, a voice, slow and rasped, almost animal. You are not in your place. I turned. It was Brother Mathis, standing completely still. No breath, no blink. He raised a hand and pointed behind me. I ran. I didn't go to the police. I went to the old preacher, Father Delling, who'd known my father. I told him what I saw. He looked me dead in the eyes and said, what you saw wasn't madness. It was method. He said the Thornwells had used sacred authority and pseudoscience to mask what was really happening, a ritualized dismantling of selfhood built over decades. He'd tried once to confront them, found a bird nailed to his door the next morning, still alive, wings shredded, beak sewn shut. You can't fight minds that believe they're cleansing souls, he said. They've already erased guilt. The next week, I quit. I left Grayston entirely, but nightmares followed. I kept hearing the looped recordings. Stillness is virtue. Emotion is corrosion. Silence is the gift. I saw that girl in dreams, mouth stitched closed, blood dripping into her lap, but her eyes begging, not for freedom, for someone to remember she'd been real. Others saw things too. One coal delivery man swore he saw a woman hanging upside down, her arms extended like wings, whispering Latin backward. A plumber fixing pipes below room 7 found a bucket with teeth inside, all baby teeth, perfectly cleaned, arranged in a spiral. And a nurse, who only worked 1 week at the estate, wrote this in her resignation letter. There is no illness in those girls, only programming. Their sickness is the cure they were given. After I spoke to Father Delling, he vanished within the month. Authorities claimed he relocate. But I visited his cottage. His books were burned, his dog dead in the garden, every mirror turned to face the wall. No one called it murder. No one called it anything. Because by then, the town had learned, ask nothing, repeat phrases, forget what the eyes scream. Now, years later, I'm the last who saw what lay under the Thornwell estate. I kept the photo, one image from that basement wall, the girl in the chair. Her name was Isabel. The red ribbon in her hair wasn't just a keepsake. It was a mark. Not of resistance, but of unfinished programming. And that's what haunts me most. She wasn't hollowed yet. She was waiting her turn. At first, they looked fine. They stepped off the Thornwell estate grounds dressed cleanly, their hair combed, their backs straight. Most of them even smiled. But it wasn't a real smile. It was trained, like the face of someone who'd been told what happiness should look like and forced to rehearse it until their cheek muscles obeyed. Families were overjoyed. "She's home," they'd cry. "She's healed." But then the quiet began. Eleanor Thornwell, the first to come back, no longer spoke about poetry or music or anything at all unless prompted. She responded to every question with precise, unnatural pauses. "Yes, Mother, I am grateful. I will obey. I am corrected." She no longer hugged anyone. She wouldn't pet her old dog. And when asked to say grace before dinner, she said a line no one recognized. "Let the mirror hold nothing. Let the sound return clean." Her mother wept that night. But when Eleanor asked why she was crying, she didn't seem upset, only confused. Next was Clara Meyer, the maid, released from the institute after her restorative therapy. She returned to town but wouldn't touch coins or clocks or mirrors. She whispered to herself constantly and refused to sleep indoors. One evening, she stood outside her old cottage and told her sister, "They gave me a room where the echo never ended. Now I can't tell what I'm thinking or what I've been told to remember." She died walking into a frozen pond, eyes wide open. Even children weren't spared. Lydia Graves, age 9, had been sent to the manor for daydreaming and disrespect. She returned 6 months later with a scar across her scalp, clearly from a craniotomy, though the family had never been told of any surgery. Her father said she'd been cured. She didn't interrupt anymore. She didn't ask questions. But she also didn't blink for long periods, didn't recognize her dolls, and asked why her shadow didn't move the same way anymore. She died in her sleep within 3 months. The doctor claimed natural causes. Her diary was found, filled with one sentence repeated over and over. "There is no more I. There is only instruction." What they all had in common were the silences, moments where their faces would go blank and they would freeze, completely still, eyes wide like a machine waiting to be powered on again. Then they would blink, smile, and resume as if nothing happened. One man described it as, like they were buffering, like their brains had a script and needed to catch up. Fathers were proud at first. "She's finally obedient," they'd say. "No more talking back." But as weeks passed, they realized something was deeply wrong. Daughters no longer laughed at old jokes. Sons no longer flinched at pain. Spouses stopped kissing goodnight. The human spark, the subtle, chaotic thing that makes people real, was gone. Some couldn't remember entire chunks of their lives. One woman, Marianne Fielding, didn't recognize her own wedding photo. She stared at it and asked, "Who is this looking at me through the frame?" Others developed severe light sensitivity, flinching at daylight or hiding from open windows. Some had night terrors, some couldn't sleep at all, and some began mimicking voices, repeating things loved ones had said, but in a flat, toneless delivery, like a playback error. A few tried to seek answers. Dr. Quentin Bell, a family physician, examined one returned girl and found surgical marks on her temples and the back of her neck. He took samples of her hair and skin, sent them to a lab. The results? Inconclusive. Cellular trauma present, but no known medical cause. Days later, he suffered a fall from his second-story window. He survived, but lost speech function. His notes were taken by the town council and never returned to his wife. Families slowly fell apart. The Thornwells offered no apologies, no explanation. When concerned parents sent letters, they received cold replies. "We regret your discomfort. Please understand that restoration is not always recognizable by untrained eyes." And the most disturbing part? Some of the returnees began to defend the Institute. They said things like, "It made me clean. The old me was noise. I only speak when I am spoken through." One woman, Marjorie Ellens, visited her friend who had returned from the estate. She offered her an old gift, a red ribbon she'd loved as a girl. The friend stared at it, didn't touch it, then said, "That belonged to someone else. She has been removed." The red ribbon became a symbol, a marker. Locals whispered that anyone who still had their ribbon intact hadn't been fully broken, but if the ribbon was burned or forgotten or refused, they'd been hollowed completely. By 1931, only 4 people had returned to Greyston after entering Thornwell Manor. None remained unchanged. 2 were dead. 1 was institutionalized. 1 disappeared. But still, the town said nothing. They preferred the illusion. Obedience looked like peace, and peace, even in its most monstrous form, was easier to swallow than the truth. They didn't come back healed. They came back erased. Her name was Isabel Greaves. She wasn't born defiant, but life carved her that way. By 16, she'd been punished more times for questions than any boy had been rewarded for answers. In a small town like Greyston, that made her dangerous. She refused a marriage proposal arranged by her father, said she wouldn't marry a man who smelled of brandy and spoke like ownership. She read books about anatomy, poetry, astronomy, and marked pages with her own thoughts in the margins. She refused to confess sins she didn't believe were sins. When the parish noticed her influence on other girls, teaching them to think critically, to speak up, they called her troubled. When she refused to apologize, they called her corrupted. And by 17, she was sent to Thornwell Manor. She arrived on a gray November morning, the air soaked with fog. They took her coat, her books, her voice, literally. For the first 3 days, no one spoke to her directly. Instead, a speaker above her cot played a looped message. "You are not who you think. You are not who you were. You will be shaped." She was kept in a room called the Stillwell Chamber, where no corners existed. Everything was curved. It disoriented her sense of space. There were no reflective surfaces, no clocks. Her meals came without seasoning or color. Beige food, beige tray, beige silence. Once a day, someone entered, always masked, always silent. On the 7th day, they spoke. "Begin your cleansing. Confess the noise inside you." She said nothing. They poured ice water on her until her lips turned purple. She still said nothing. They took her to room 13. No records of that room survive, except Isabel's smuggled writings. She etched them into cloth scraps with a quill made of bone, dipped in ink she made by crushing dried berries and mixing them with her own blood. One fragment read, "They speak to me through walls. They believe I am folding. I am not. I am watching." She was isolated for 6 weeks. They removed all stimuli, no sound, no human contact. Just white light and occasional injections, haloperidol likely, meant to dull resistance. But Isabel had already memorized the shifts of the GUI, guards, the placement of the ventilation grates, the rhythm of the hallway lights. Her crime had been free thought. Her punishment was silencing. But while others forgot who they were, Isabel remembered everything, not just her life, but the suffering of the girls she saw through the glass. She saw Eleanor, shivering with a voice that no longer rose above a whisper. She saw Clara, hands trembling, lips stitched by fear. She understood the system. Each room was not a prison, but a funnel, designed to narrow identity until it dripped out, drop by drop, leaving only compliance. But Isabel had learned to write without paper. She scratched symbols into her skin, into dirt beneath her bed, into bread crust. She made ink from smashed beetles. She used strands of her own hair to sew messages into her pillow seam. And when they asked her again in week 7 to speak the creed, "I am hollow. I am grateful. I obey," she said, "I am Isabel Greaves. I remember what you did." Her rebellion wasn't loud. That's what made it work. She played the part, smiled when they entered, ate their tasteless meals, folded her hands, waited until the day of the storm. March 2nd, 1932. Lightning cracked the eastern roof. The manor's north wing flooded, generators flickered, the security circuit failed, and Isabel was ready. She had memorized the time gaps between shift changes. She had created a small pick from broken glass hidden inside the heel of her slipper. When the nurse on duty came to check her vitals, Isabel was gone. She didn't just flee. She took evidence, stolen records, pages from audio reels, a list of victim names and treatments, carefully copied by hand, photos, those the Thornwells thought had been destroyed. She ran barefoot through the flooded corridor, her red ribbon wrapped around her wrist like a signal flag, down through the whisper spine, through the ventilation shaft, out into the storm. No one followed. They hadn't believed escape was possible. That's how deep their arrogance had grown. By sunrise, she arrived at the Harrow Township clinic, mud-smeared, shaking, half-frozen. But she was alive. And she remembered everything. Her final words before collapsing, "They took the voices of 53 girls. But mine is still mine." They tried to silence her again. The Thornwells said she was delusional. Paid physicians tried to discredit her. Letters vanished. Witnesses disappeared. But the papers she carried, handwritten, blood-marked, undeniable, forced an investigation. A raid was ordered. But the manor was already empty. The corridors had been bleached, the machines dismantled, the jars removed. But the walls remained. And inside those walls, something was still whispering. She was the one they couldn't break. And because of her, their silence finally screamed. It took 2 days for the town to respond. By then, Isabel was stable, barely. She had hypothermia, fractured ribs, deep bruises, and signs of sedation withdrawal. But she kept repeating the same list of names: Lydia Graves, Rosalind Fay, Eleanor Thornwell, Clara Meyer, 53 in total, names in the ledger. The Harrow Township Clinic doctor contacted the county board. The documents Isabel had smuggled, water-stained but legible, were presented as evidence of criminal malpractice and illegal experimentation. Inside them were logs of surgical procedures labeled compliance reinforcement, dosage notes for mind-altering sedatives, rotations of names marked corrected, failed, or removed, and one list titled only unfinished. On March 5, 1932, a formal warrant was signed. 6 armed deputies, 2 city doctors, and a court recorder made their way to Thornwell Manor under orders to investigate and detain. The town watched in silence as the vehicles disappeared into the fog. They would return, changed. The manor loomed in the morning mist, strangely still, as if holding breath. The gates, usually shut tight, stood open. No guards, no staff, no voices. Inside, the team encountered only emptiness, not abandonment, cleansing. Beds were perfectly made, trays polished. No bodies, no residents, but everything reeked of ammonia, bleach, and blood long washed. Still they pressed on. In the west wing they found a locked drawer with half-burned letters addressed from parents, unopened, audio reels with warped recordings of girls repeating phrases in broken monotone, surgical trays still wet with saline. In room 13, the infamous forbidden wing, they found scratch marks in the walls forming incomplete names, blood-soaked fabric scraps, one with Isabel sewn in faint red thread, a burned journal with only one page left intact, reading, "We're not supposed to know who we were." The basement, though, was something else entirely. When the door was pried open, the air was heavy, moist, and metallic. They found jars hidden behind false panels, dozens of them. Inside were preserved vocal cords, segments of human tongue, strips of skin marked with ink, phrases like "I was wrong" and "I am gone." They found brains, clearly removed post-mortem, floating in clear solution, tagged with numbers but no names, and shelves lined with photo albums all blanked out, eyes scratched, faces blurred, captions removed, like history had been scrubbed by hand. The raid team documented everything. The 2 doctors tried to carry out samples, but 3 men fell violently ill after spending 20 minutes near the Whisper Spine tunnel. One began muttering Isabel's name without realizing it. Another vomited blood. The third collapsed and never regained his voice. One deputy returned home and burned his uniform that night. He was heard whispering, "I saw her mouth sewn with piano wire. I still hear the music." But no living person was found. No trace of Dr. Halbridge. No sign of Brother Mathis. No sisters. No guards. No patients. Nothing. Only their work remained. Back in Harrow, Isabel was interviewed, but her health began to fail. She developed seizures, intense light sensitivity, and sudden episodes of silence lasting hours. Doctors claimed delayed trauma-induced catatonia. Before she slipped entirely, she told a nurse, "They didn't run. They became what they wanted. They took the knowledge. They left the blood." The court ruled the Thornwell estate a site of illegal imprisonment and unauthorized experimentation. But no arrests were made, no public trial, no family received compensation. The building was shuttered, barred, locked with iron chains, but not destroyed. The town refused to tear it down. Some say it was fear, others say it was guilt. Then the whispers began again. Local children heard tapping from the cellar at night. One girl went missing during a dare to touch the front door. A stray dog was found near the fence, its eyes gone, but still breathing. And in 1934, a university professor from Boston visited the ruins for historical analysis. He took photos, made notes, returned east. Within 6 months, his university published a research paper titled Behavioral Compliance Through Environmental Modulation. No mention of Thornwell. No credit to Isabel. Just theories, data, charts, footnotes. The horror became a study. Isabel disappeared shortly after. She left the clinic under a false name, changed towns, lived quietly as a librarian in a coastal village, never married, never spoke of her past. Her obituary simply read, Isabel G. passed peacefully in her sleep. She is survived by no one. But her red ribbon was found in her bedside drawer, still folded, still unburned. The reckoning came. But the devils had already fled. What remained was proof. And in the silence, memory began to rot. The Thornwell estate was locked, condemned, and officially sealed in 1933. But sealed is not the same as destroyed. For decades it stood there, gray stone and rotten windows, wrapped in ivy and fog, the upper floor cave, ed in like a broken skull. Townspeople stopped looking at it. Parents stopped pointing it out. It became background, like a scar the town didn't remember getting. The official records called it a failed girls' seminary. No mention of the experiments, no names of the victims, no photos. The surviving materials were either lost in transfer or stored in state archives under restricted access. Even the raid report, the only government record of what was found in that basement, was buried under a medical classification. Case file number 21-B. Involuntary cognitive reformatting. Unverified evidence. The note at the bottom simply read, Case closed due to lack of prosecutable data. Isabel was never named publicly. The nurse who had cared for her at Harrow tried to speak out once. She wrote a letter to a Boston newspaper in 1937, warning about psychological conditioning being misused under the veil of reform. The letter was rejected. She died in a fire 6 months later. Her house was the only one on the block that burned. The cause was never found. Of the 53 girls confirmed to have entered Thornwell between 1922 and 1932, only 5 were ever tracked again. 2 were dead within a year. 2 institutionalized. 1, Isabel, vanished under a false name. The others? Some say they were relocated. Others say the Thornwells moved them like inventory, sold their silence, transferred them to clinics, gave them new identities. But in truth, most of them likely ended up like the red ribbons, burned, buried, forgotten. Still, fragments remained. In 1956, a construction team digging near the Thornwell well site found a metal box wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside were 13 hair ribbons, one with the name Rosalind stitched inside, a page torn from an anatomy textbook with the phrase, "Her soul is mapped here," scribbled in ink, a bone-handled knife etched with 3 tally marks. It was handed to the local sheriff. He filed it as ritual debris and never reopened the case. The Thornwell name lived on. In 1964, a private research firm called Hallbridge Solutions was founded in Connecticut. It specialized in emotional reframing therapy. The founder, a man named Julian Hallbridge, Jr., claimed to be the son of a Scottish physician who'd worked in reformist psychiatry. Today, the company holds patents related to behavioral correction devices. No one connects the dots, or rather, those who do don't speak. The town of Greyston still stands. But ask anyone about the manor, and their expression shifts. Some laugh nervously. Oh, that old place, just ruins now. Some avoid the question entirely, nothing there worth remembering, and some simply lie, never heard of it. The children play in other fields. No one goes near the east woods. But one child, not long ago, said something strange. He came home from school holding a ribbon. Red stained, frayed at the edges. When asked where he found it, he said, "A girl gave it to me. She said her name was Isabel." In 1993, the estate caught fire. The official report claimed lightning struck the chimney, igniting the rotted interior, but eyewitnesses said there had been no storm that night. One man, an old postal worker, watched from his porch and swore he saw a figure standing in the second-story window, lit by flame. He said the figure didn't scream. She just stood there, watching. When they cleared the rubble the next morning, they found no human remains, only a scorched wall. And carved into that wall were the final words anyone would ever read from inside Thornwell. "Do not erase what you did. The earth remembers what you try to bury." By 2000, the land was bought by a development company planning to build condos. Surveyors arrived, but every time they tried to drill, their equipment failed. Power outages, GPS errors. One worker broke his ankle in a sudden hole, but the soil showed no signs of instability. Within 3 weeks, the project was abandoned. No one else ever tried. Now it's just trees and silence. The manor is gone, but the stories linger like smoke. Locals speak in half-whispers. A few still leave flowers where the fence once stood. Most have forgotten, or pretend to. But in the basement of a Boston library, under special request, you can access box number 3447A. Inside are Isabel's surviving letters, a broken hair comb, a torn page from her smuggled notes, and one final photograph. In it, a teenage girl stares through a shattered window. Her eyes are tired but fierce, a ribbon clutched in her fist. And if you look closely at the background, past the shadows and cracks, you can just make out a chalkboard. On it is written, "I remember all of them, and I will not let the world forget." Because they didn't just erase names. They didn't just silence girls. They tried to rewrite pain into obedience and call it healing. But the ground remembers. The walls remember. And somewhere, deep in the marrow of history, she remembers. No one ever rebuilt on the land, but the earth still remembers.